today we're discussing the question of climate change and whether or not South Africa has set itself very ambitious targets: 34% of carbon reductions by the year 2020, 45% by the year 2025. We heard earlier on that all of these are voluntary targets that South Africa is embarking on, and it's all subject to consensus being reached globally. We know that the UN Summit on Climate Change didn't really lead to much resolution, with bigger countries having grand expectations of developing countries, and developing countries fundamentally raising the issue: how do you expect us to grow, create jobs, change livelihoods if we can't do so following an industrial path that richer economies have done? These are some issues of balance and justice. And right now I want to raise issues of adaptation. How do we inform the public so that we adapt to a changing context? Temperatures are going to rise in South Africa by about 1 degree Celsius to 3 degrees Celsius. With the Earth's surface getting warmer, what does that mean for my life? What does that mean for the livelihood of the farmer? What does it mean broadly for all of us?
Well, in South Africa, it depends very much where you live as well. So depending on which part of the country, whether a sea level rise will affect you, or whether you will have too much rain too often, floods, or whether there will be more drought, and what plants will grow there in the future. So it affects to a large extent things like food security, whereas before you might have been able to grow maize in a certain area. Now you can't perhaps grow it in that area anymore. And that translates further into how do you package that maize? If it used to be in paper, now if it's more wet, you may have to put plastic around it. And you know, the cost of transport. So climate change is going to affect us in a different way in this country, depending on where we live, but certainly is going to affect us a lot because we are a developing country.
Stephen, Glenda raises the issue of not just food security, but even efficiencies in how we use transportation, for instance. And this is a big issue because we don't have a very efficient public transportation system, and I give it to government, they're working on it. But what that effectively has created a situation where every middle-class South African who can afford it has a car. Traffic congestion, pollution, and so on and so forth. How can we mitigate against that?
Well, it's difficult to change the fuel. There aren't any mature options which are in place to replace fossil fuel, liquid fuels. But we can start designing cities better so they're more concentrated. People have to travel less far to go to work, for example. And we can also start thinking about what the public transport systems are like. You know that Cairo is the only city on the African continent with an underground train. We now have an overground train in Gauteng, but we've got to start thinking about more rapid transport systems that give an advantage to public transport, because that ends up being way more efficient.
We're also told, Tasneem, that within the next 20, 30 years, the global population is going to rise by 50%, and that Africa is the continent where we're seeing the most rapid pace of urbanization. Proposals about greening cities, for instance, proposals about rolling out solar heaters in how we construct homes, talking about retrofilling ceilings. How's the government received a lot of these proposals? Are we starting to see those changes?
I think we're going to see some of those, in fact, becoming regulatory in the future. So mandatory energy efficiency, obligations on the built environment, on the private sector in terms of green building standards, etc. But I do want to say that, in fact, there's been lots of wonderful initiatives already. You know, the Green Building Council has set up standards for green buildings, the built environment, for the construction industry as well. And there are things happening here, you know, homegrown alternatives. And we should be proud of that and actually ramp that up quite substantially. But I do think we are going to need regulations in the future to guide those standards so that we do implement.
Thembani, we've spent a lot of time discussing business, and I'm going to continue on that tack. Business has said, you know, on paper, the IRP 2010 looks pretty good. In principle, the targets are moral and right, but economically this thing doesn't make sense. Even though the government talks about a renewable energy feed-in tariff, the so-called refit, to make investments in renewables a little more attractive, the link between what you put in and what you get back in terms of a fair return on investment is too disconnected. What more can the government do to try to make this economically viable and attractive for investors?
The introduction of renewable energies via refit, the inputs or the feedback that I have is that the investors who have the money and the willingness are very, very interested in coming to invest here. And if you look at the returns that they would be getting, they're in the sort of range that makes investors take their money out of the banks and put it into projects. The other part that has been done on the refit, it is not just that the investors should get a return, it is also to just ensure that when they come, they don't bring solar panels wherever they are made. They come and make solar panels here, they come and make the silicon here, so as to create the 17, 18 jobs that are seen per megawatt in the different countries. So the strategy of attracting them via refit is not just on the returns, but it's to ensure that when they come, it is worthwhile for them to come, and it is worthwhile for this country as well to have those sort of technology.
I think on that poignant note, I'd like to leave this discussion and open it up for an interactive session with our audience who are here, seated patiently. Yes, sir, your question.
I would like to share my experience regarding the private sector and the public sector based on trying to save energy. We are a specialist company trying to assist industries to save on energy. So what I've done, I've been talking to company CEOs and GMs and COOs of various blue chip companies and the government. Now, the attitude that I get is, as a society, we suffer a serious complacency. Now, this disease diminishes the willpower. Now, it's not the lack of funds. It's not that at all. It's a lack of will to do significant change to our habits and therefore save our planet. So probably, maybe with time I can share a little bit more details, but that is what I've established up to this point.
Do you agree that there's a lack of political will?
I think it's a lack of personal will the gentleman is referring to, behavioral stuff. But there are also major institutional barriers. Each one of our municipalities taxes electricity. So the more they sell, the more tax they get in. Where's the incentive for them, unless they can be rewarded somehow for doing things more efficiently? Where is the reward to give that gentleman the opportunities that he's looking for and the assistance from political figures within local government and within the utility?
You gave us an emphatic yes.
Yeah, no, I think that there is a matter of political will, but it's linked also to policy incoherence. I mean, sometimes when you look at the policies coming out of government, you would swear that the one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. And so, for example, we have the announcements of the targets, and then we have the IRP 2010 process, which in fact doesn't, there's come some way of factoring in carbon, but it won't go far enough to deal with fulfilling those targets. So I do think it is a lack of policy coherence and political will. It's a challenging time in South Africa, and one can understand that politicians would make statements about achieving job creation and poverty alleviation, and they see that as contrary to achieving the others as well.
As much as the government and others may not be doing this, but I think part of the education is or information around energy efficiency is required. You don't need a municipality to tell you to save whatever you can save by using electricity efficiency. You don't need them. You don't need their permission. You don't need most of the things that are required. So as much as they have their role to play, but we as a society also have our role to play, and we don't need their permission to do certain things.
Another question from the audience?
For a couple of years now, I'm very worried about climate change. I've started free trees to schools, dishing out thousands over the 5.5-year period, trying to change the climate in a small way, and if everybody would do that. But my question is, government is very concerned with concentrating on solar energy as well as wind power. Usually, wind power creates a lot of noise pollution, so it depends on how closely it's situated to cities. So we try in every area to reduce pollution, noise pollution. So I was wondering, South Africa has got such a large coastal area, rather utilizing a very clean source of energy by installing sea mills, utilizing wave energy to create a power source. It's a clean operation. It can be installed a bit further away from the cities, so you reduce noise pollution.
You know, energy from the sea?
Yeah, look, it's still an immature technology, but it's being tested and tested at bigger and bigger scale, and it seems to be getting somewhere in terms of reducing the cost per unit. And this is the issue of technological learning. It's the most powerful policy driver for transforming an energy economy, much more powerful than carbon taxes. So the lady, I'd like to congratulate her on what she's doing and say, yes, this is something we've got to be testing and learning about so as to reduce the individual costs of these units.
Okay, another question. Yes, sir.
Just to pick up on a couple of facts that have been mentioned here and try and get some science into it. And ma'am, I live in Pinetown as well. There has been research, I know, done on the use of wave energy. I'm a fully, but unfortunately, I don't think it's proved viable, but I know there has been research done on that. That's number one. The 34%, I don't think it's achievable. The concern I've got, we may have the money and resources. I don't know if we've got the brain power in this country, to be honest. That's my concern. I don't know if we've got the skills and the brain power in this country. I think one gentleman over here mentioned about the willpower. It's very much the willpower. People are creatures of habit and they don't want to change. There are many ways in which energy, water, etc. can be conserved and renewed and changed if people were prepared to change their habits. And then one question for the panel. Is there a future for nuclear energy? Because I think there is. Thank you.
Yes, there is a future for nuclear. When we talk about the emissions reduction that would achieve the 34%, in that mix you are using more than 10 gigawatt hours of nuclear, solar and wind. And if you look at the draft integrated resources plan, it talks about bringing in nuclear around 2023. And if there are other changes in the other mixes, you may even have it earlier. So there is a future for nuclear. But in the other one of landfill gas, you happen to be in the one city that is the only city in this country that's licensed to generate electricity from landfill, and they are generating it and they are injecting it into their own municipal, eThekwini municipal grid, and when required, they inject it into the grid. So I don't know which parts of Eskom have not allowed it. Another municipality that's also in this area, in Mhlatuze, is also generating and feeding into the grid gas that they get from the landfill side. So
these have been the Shell Energy Dialogues coming to you from the Ushaka Marine World in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa.